Cast your minds back to a bygone era, the mid-90s, when the internet was new, TVs were big, and a new generation of gaming was taking hold, the 5th generation. The Sony PlayStation came out in late 1994 in Japan and mid-1995 in North America. When you think of the original PlayStation, what comes to mind? Revolutionary and iconic games, the generation of 3D gaming breaking out on a mainstream level for the first time, the first console to sell over 100 million units, the budding rivalry between Nintendo fans and PlayStation fans, crude nicknames such as the phony gay station, but what probably wouldn't come to mind is excessively large game cases. The type of case that's most largely associated with the Sony PlayStation were jewel cases, the same type of cases that your average audio CD would go into. However, when the Sony PlayStation released and for roughly the next year of its existence, its games came in obscenely large packaging which has been collectively called long boxes. To my knowledge, 102 games on the PlayStation were sold in long boxes before they were phased out in favor of jewel cases. Everything you could imagine, from A-Train to Zoop. It was a trailblazing era in video game history that's been largely forgotten, and I'd like to shed a little light on it. Surprisingly, these cases were not a thing all over the world. Long boxes for PlayStation were only in North America, which I think speaks to the general attitude that the rest of the world has towards North America, and in particular the USA. A lot of international media companies have this idea that people in the States don't appreciate or even acknowledge subtlety at all. Things need to be loud and in your face for their idea of simple-minded Americans to even give it the time of day, which is also why you see a lot of strange regional changes in North America, like giving Kirby angry eyes or making terrible box art generally. This thought pattern is also why you see so many game covers that boil down to guy with gun. It honestly probably wasn't even something that the executives at Sony put much thought into. The North American industry standard was obscenely large packaging at the time. Just look at the Sega CD from a few years before, or the 3DO, a console that only came out in North America about a year before the PlayStation came out in Japan. Or one of the PlayStation's contemporaries, the Sega Saturn, all of which featured obscenely large cases for standard-sized CDs. I speculate that if nothing else, Sony wanted to have a presentation equal to the Sega Saturn, which was at launch the PlayStation's biggest competitor. That's not even to mention the tradition of big box PC games, the designs of which were non-standardized due to PC being more open source. I guess the idea at the time was that size equated to value, and so the larger you made the box, the more it subliminally communicated to the average consumer how much your game is worth regardless of how good or bad it was. All that mattered was the money that was on display, or at least that was the thought pattern going in. For PC games especially that was the case, because without a standardized game box, you needed to stand out in any which way you could based on the playing field you were on. It was essentially a giant dick measuring contest between all the major players. The Super Nintendo and Nintendo 64 also had fairly large boxes, but those had the excuse that cartridges were much larger than CDs. These PlayStation boxes came in 3 variants. First of all, you had large jewel cases very reminiscent of the Sega CD or Sega Saturn cases. Then you had a standard cardboard box, which has a very similar look and feel to a hardcover book, and the most common of these cases, the ridged case. It's strange that there were 3 styles of box for the same console. I don't think there's ever been another example of a non-unified game box style like this. You certainly wouldn't have that happen today, but there's a good explanation for this. From what I understand, when the PlayStation was originally released, the ridged case was the intended final design to be used by all games. However, said design wasn't ready for manufacturing by release, so Sony had to quickly whip up the cardboard case as a temporary fix, while some developers opted instead to purchase Sega Saturn cases in bulk for their games. The haphazard nature of the manufacturing process might also explain why games like Wing Commander 3 come as 4 discs in 4 separate sleeves inside a cardboard box, when most later multi-disc games would have specifically designed cases. It speaks to this Wild West sensibility that makes this era appeal to me so much, because this was back when gaming was still in its infancy and 3D gaming was a brand new thing. So what you ended up with was this chaotic arms race where all these different developers were throwing shit at the wall to see what stuck, seeing how to best utilize 3D in games, what genres worked and what didn't work in this unprecedented cutting-edge technology, what control schemes were best used for what genres. This was an era where, possibly more than any other era, no 2 games played exactly the same. It was excitingly experimental, and with the 3D console arms race being so young, everybody was in a rush to try and make this generation's first true killer app and breakout success. The games wildly varied in quality and design. You had some developers absolutely nail it right off the bat with games such as Twisted Metal, Jumping Flash, Warhawk, Tekken, Resident Evil, Descent, and so on. And then you had some games that completely crapped the bed as soon as they had the chance to sleep in it, such as Criticom, Battle Arena Toshinden, and Jupiter Strike. Things these days are much more high quality on average, but also the current level of standardization makes things less exciting in that you can usually have a pretty good idea of exactly what you're going to get before you play a lot of games. But back then, it truly did feel like with every game you were strapping yourself into somebody else's crazy ride. Good or bad, you're going to have something to talk about. Of course, the Wild West of 3D is even more apropos than it sounds because this is a snapshot in time. So within this snapshot, you can get a very immediate look at the design standards and attitudes within the larger gaming landscape. And in particular Sony, because this era represents a few backwards ideas within Sony Computer Entertainment America. Chief among them being the company's staunch anti-2D games policy, which they thankfully toned down in the coming year or two. But trying to get any non-3D game approved for release at this time was apparently an extreme challenge. In fact, while this was a while later, there's an ever-present unverified rumor that Capcom threatened to not release Resident Evil 2 on PlayStation unless Sony approved the release of Mega Man 8. But I can't speak on the validity of that rumor. That said, you still did get 2D games in and amongst this era, most notably things like Rayman or Gex, the former of which is possibly the most fondly remembered game of this period. But those were the exception rather than the rule during the Longbox era and beyond. Now, of course, because these cases were only around for less than a year, and most if not all of these games would be released with the standard jewel case later with a much wider and longer availability, Longbox games these days are somewhat rare depending on the game, and as such tend to carry a bit of a price premium. You can usually find any of the sports games for less than $20 a piece. However, if you want to hunt down the more core games of this collection, you're looking at a significant price increase compared to the jewel case counterpart. For example, you can easily find a copy of Rayman in a jewel case for roughly $20, but the Longbox copy tends to fetch prices starting at around $50 depending on the condition. I myself have felt this sting, with Viewpoint and Nova Storm putting me down $80 a piece. And to be honest, outside of the rarity, neither of these games are worth the price. That's the major embuggerance with collecting these. Even as a connoisseur of the Longbox format, I can honestly say they're more trouble than they're worth, especially for the games you're getting, which more often than not aren't the best. At least if you're buying a new game for a similar price as you would pay for one of these games, you know that the new game is going to be relatively worth the price because the pricing is based off something more than novelty and rarity, with quality taking a back seat. It's fairly universal in the console cycle that the first calendar year of a console's lifespan will be the roughest because with the console being so new, developers will be trying to get to grips with the technology. So the scattershot quality is fairly endemic with this particular snapshot in history. The launch lineup in particular was fairly underwhelming with a few exceptions, as well as the few games that actually came out before the console was officially released, like Total Eclipse Turbo. So this era should be more lauded for its experimentation and innovation than the games themselves. Sometimes it's easy to forget, especially these days with nostalgia being so ever-present in the video game market, that when you have a collection of games from a specific moment in time, that it's not a modern-made retro throwback. It's a genuine time capsule of its era. So it's interesting to look at these games as a collection and see the trends that were going on in 1995 and early 1996. Despite being an experimental era, there were still plenty of devs following trends just like any other era. Though it's worth taking into account that many games of this era were ports from the 3DO and Sega CD, which means measuring trends isn't the easiest in this era, as you have to first make sure to quantify whether or not a game is fully original and made in this era, or if it's a case of an existing game from a few years previous. But of the definitive trends for new games, you saw plenty of one-on-one fighters, digitized or otherwise, plenty of Doom-style first-person shooters, plenty of flight sims, all of which are good genres to have around. The one genre that was still trendy around this time but thankfully died out soon after were FMV games, such as D, Brain Dead 13, or Psychic Detective. When CD-ROM technology was first implemented for video games, some devs had the bright idea to use the added space to combine games with movies. It was an era that lasted exactly as long as it took for the novelty to wear off, because most full FMV games were awful, with the exception of games like Wing Commander 3, which remember to be games first, FMV second. So it's interesting to see that that trend was still alive and kicking somewhat when the PlayStation was in its infancy. What's even crazier is seeing an entire era of PlayStation without JRPGs or 3D platformers, with the exception of Jumping Flash. I argue that those are the genres most commonly associated with the PlayStation, but the trendsetters Final Fantasy VII for JRPGs and Mario 64/Crash Bandicoot for 3D platformers wouldn't come out for some time. Matter of fact, I have a bit of a Mandela effect thing going on because for some reason I remember first run editions of Crash Bandicoot being released in the Longbox format. The exact number of games that were released as long boxes has been disputed because some apparent complete lists have games that were blatantly always released in jewel cases. Most lists will give you a number between 104 and 106, which doesn't match up with my personal account of 102. I think this was a case of various websites regurgitating information from each other without verifying it for themselves, which happens a lot more than you think. The two games that were included on the Giant Bomb list in particular that had no other verified source saying they had a long box variant was Daredevil Derby 3D and Triple Play 98, both of which came out a significant chunk of time after the other games on the list, the former being October 1996 and the latter May of 97, and both of which threw me through a loop trying to verify the validity of their inclusion. I don't know where the author got their information because I did quite an extensive amount of digging and could not find any information on these two games or why they were on the compilation. It was likely some sort of mix-up. But these aren't the only games to be falsely identified as having this variant in-game case. The most interesting case, no pun intended, of a game being included on a list of long box games, while not technically coming in one, was for the game Space Hulk: Vengeance of the Blood Angels, a game that I happened to pick up on a whim a while back, coincidentally. It's unremarkable to say the least. It was a game that was definitely falsely put on the list, but unlike the other games on these various compilations, this one kept turning up results of actual long box copies existing, despite no listings on various sites or even info on the validity of the variant's existence. So I dug deeper and found out what was happening with this specific game. Within collector circles, rumors of this game having a long box variant permeated for a long time with no real evidence, other than being on some advertisements in old gaming magazines. It was essentially an urban myth. That was until a number of years back when a handful of copies of the elusive variant popped up on eBay apropos of nothing. Questions started to be asked about if these copies were real or if it was just some scammer trying to make a quick buck off a myth. The owner of the site Rave got his hands on one and proved the urban myth to be true. There are indeed existing versions of this game's case with this variant, but it was never officially released. But he was able to prove the legitimacy of the copies being sold on eBay, which poses the question of what exactly happened here. If they were ever intended to be officially sold, no one knows. The working theory is that the game may have originally been set to come out earlier than it did, and these long box versions were simply dummy game cases sent out by EA, the game's publisher, to retailers for promotional purposes. Then the game likely had some sort of sudden delay close enough to release that the hype machine had been kicked into high gear. Then during the game's delay, Sony announced their intention to switch to the standard jewel case, and EA followed suit, scrapping whatever they had in production, if anything. That is of course just the accepted theory, but whatever the exact story is, we may never know. But there definitely are copies of this variant out in the wild, however rare. We can only speculate on the specifics. But it would make sense if the game came out on the cusp of these things being phased out, that there'd be existing copies with both styles. It was bound to happen with some game, and it just so happened to be Space Hulk. So why did they switch to jewel cases after less than a year? Well, it's a simple answer. It was more economic. When you had excessively large game cases, there was a certain loudness and proudness to the size, but it was also significantly more expensive to ship. The total size of the jewel case is roughly 5.5 inches by 4 7/8 inches by 3/8 of an inch, compared to the large jewel case, which is roughly 5 11/16 inches by 8 1/8 inches by 7/8 of an inch, making for a total surface area of 10.05 cubic inches for the jewel case and roughly 40.43 cubic inches for the big boy. The measurements vary slightly depending on the different versions, but the point still stands. By my estimation, the surface area of the average long box game is roughly 4 times larger than that of a jewel case. That was the most math I've done since high school. So by shrinking the size, they may not have looked as impressive, but it also meant that you could reduce manufacturing costs by cutting the fat, so to speak, and it meant that you could ship many more units at a time, increasing the potential profit margin exponentially. Especially for something this simple to change, it makes all the sense in the world for them to cut back in order to maximize profit or use the reduced cost of manufacturing to lower the price per game, making the system more attractive for the average user. Part of what made the original PlayStation so successful was the lower cost of their games compared to the competition, especially the N64, and considering the PlayStation sold more at launch than the Saturn sold in 5 months, it quickly became clear that the PlayStation was in a completely different league to the Saturn sales-wise, so that by the time the 6 to 9 month mark rolled around, the executives at Sony probably saw that they didn't need to bother with having an equally bombastic presentation to the Saturn. That's just me baselessly speculating though. All it took was one board exec to take their brain medicine and realize they were wasting money. This also made it more convenient for the end user because it meant you could store more games on your shelf. The size and shape of the Longbox might have made storage harder for avid gamers in the long term. There's also the added bonus that replacing jewel cases is easy, whereas finding a replacement for any of these 3 variants of Longbox can be a pain in the ass. I felt the sting myself. The case for my copy of PO'd is so utterly broken that there's nothing holding the front cover to the rest of the case. And this was already a game that cost me $60. So switching was a choice that made sense for all involved outside of connoisseurs of big box releases. The final game to be released as a Longbox isn't the easiest fact to verify because different sites give me different release dates for several of these games. For example, 2 different websites said that Kingsfield 2 in Japan, came out in North America on February 15, 1996. But then the Wikipedia page for the PS1 release dates said it came out on October 11, 1996. The same goes for VR Soccer 96. The list of PlayStation release dates says it came out on October 31st, 1996, where other websites said it came out on May 1st, 1996. I'm just going to assume that the Wikipedia page for PS1 release dates is bollocks, because even in these 2 examples, it's the odd one out, with the testimony of 2 pages against 1 disputing the specific dates. There's also the matter of games that are falsely identified as having Longbox releases. The aforementioned Daredevil Derby 3D and MLB Triple Play 98 both muddied the issue quite a bit, with both of them coming out a significant chunk of time after these cases were phased out. I wanted to get to the bottom of this, so I made a spreadsheet of games that I know for certain had a definitive release date under this format, making sure to verify the ones I could with as many sources as I could and categorize them in chronological order. So with that in mind, the latest release date I could find would be Gunship coming out on July 3rd, 1996, then Shell Shock on June 30th, Fade to Black and International Track and Field both on June 28th, Triple Play 97 on June 26th, and then the next release I could find was all the way back in early June. The release dates were a mess though, with multiple sources giving me multiple dates for several games. One source saying the final game to be released under this format was Tecmo World Golf on July 10th, but multiple sources contradicted that. Then there were some games like Thunderstrike 2 where most lists refused to even acknowledge that it existed. I mean, here it is. I'm playing it. I did my best, guys, which means that if the PlayStation was released in North America on September 9th, 1995, this particular era lasted just shy of 9 months, roughly the length of your average pregnancy, which is oddly analogous to this entire era because it was back when the PS1 was still in its primordial stages, back before it had really established itself. Of the top 20 best-selling games on the PlayStation, only one, Resident Evil, was part of the initial Longbox run, and if you push that up to the top 50, that only adds an additional 2 games from this era. Games like Fade to Black, Rayman, and Loaded walked so that games like Gran Turismo, Tomb Raider, Crash Bandicoot, and Final Fantasy VII could run. But the fact that very few games of this era were particularly successful, and the ones that were likely were probably more successful long-term than short-term, is probably why this era is so forgotten, I find. Very few people that I've talked to have any idea about this particular moment in time, even those who were most familiar with PlayStation history. Sure, there are plenty of games from this era that are fondly remembered, but the era itself, I found, has been somewhat lost to the sands of time. So hopefully I've been able to shed some light on a short snapshot of the history of video games that I feel has been underrepresented. If you want a more in-depth look at these games on an individual level, I definitely recommend checking out the Game Rave website for a more detailed rundown. I'll put the link in the description along with all my other links. So while you're in the description, feel free to check out the spreadsheet as well as my Twitter for all my various ramblings and my Patreon page if you like my content and would like to donate to the cause like these people here. And an extra special thanks to users PharmaCat84, Raaf, Inutsu, and GAW004 for going above and beyond. And you can support the channel for free by liking this video, leaving a comment telling me what you think, and subscribing to the channel for more. It really does help. Elsewise than that, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Peace!